In today's video, we're looking at the most shocking daredevil deaths ever recorded. From a wingsuit pilot who clipped a rock face to a net jumper who missed his target by mere feet. It was October 2nd, 2016, in Imperial County, California. A large square net hung 200 feet above a dry lake bed from 4 mobile cranes. A small jump plane circled overhead while the ground crew watched wind flags. Tyler Nash was a 29-year-old rigging technician from San Diego with over 800 jumps. He wanted to attempt a net-only jump with no parachute, falling directly into the catching system below. Nash had trained for months and practiced with smoke canisters to judge wind drift. He worked on small body movements like shoulder rolls, foot, and head angle. He trusted his ability to judge depth and distance and relied on the way the desert horizon stayed steady when his flight path was correct. The setup on the lake bed was simple and easy to spot from the air. A 100 by 100 foot net was suspended about 200 feet above the ground from 4 mobile cranes, with a bright X marking the center. Below it, the impact zone was cleared of vehicles and equipment, and a medical unit staged nearby. The county had issued permits for the demonstration. The FAA was notified, and the sheriff's office posted a unit on the access road. At dawn, the flags barely moved. By mid-morning, the wind had increased to around 10 to 12 miles per hour and came a few degrees off the predicted direction. The flight path Nash planned assumed light wind from behind, but the crosswind grew stronger, pushing the flight line to the south. Nash rode up in the jump plane with a spotter and a cameraman. He wore an oxygen mask for the climb and a GPS logger. On the ground, spotters used wind flags and a handheld anemometer. The plan called for a stable belly-down fall to build speed, then a roll to head down in the last few thousand feet to adjust the line. While he was still in the plane, radio traffic stayed calm as the crew chief called out wind readings and suggested a wave off and reset if the crosswind drift looked wrong. Nash pulled off the mask seconds before exit. Nash exited the plane cleanly and held a steady position. As he fell, the crosswind pulled his flight path a few feet off center. He rolled slightly to correct his position, then rolled back. Spotters tracked his position against the center mark for the log. The net filled more of the camera frame as he got closer. In the final seconds, he came in high and moving fast. A spotter standing at the base of a mobile crane said Nash was slightly off target before he disappeared from view. He hit the edge of the net webbing, bounced outside the square, and fell through the gap beyond the frame. The impact zone team ran toward him. The pilot climbed and held clear as briefed. The scene remained controlled as emergency responders reached Nash. The sheriff's unit secured the area while medical personnel worked. The crew secured and then lowered the net for safety and documentation and began packing equipment. Deputies took statements from the pilot, the crew chief, and the 2 closest observers, including the spotter who had called out the drift measurements. Later, the GPS data showed his path veered a few degrees in the last 1,000 feet, matching what the wind flags indicated. Nash's funeral was held a week later at a small church in San Diego. Friends from the jumping community brought his helmet and logbook to the service. County officials reviewed the setup with an independent engineer. The engineer found the rig met its stated load specs, but left little margin if a jumper arrived off-center. The FAA and the sheriff's office listed the death as accidental, with wind drift as a contributing factor. The county coroner ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma. In the local jumping community, the incident served as a warning that being slightly off target can be dangerous when the landing area is small and wind conditions change. It was July the 22nd, 2017, in Yosemite National Park, California. A narrow ribbon of webbing stretched between 2 rock points near Taft Point. The drop below was more than 2,000 feet to the valley floor. Evan Cole was 28 years old and worked at a gear shop in Reno. He spent weekends on slacklines and highlines. Cole was known for careful knots, neat anchors, and long practice sessions. More on clean technique than social media attention. He kept records of each session in a spiral notebook. That morning, he wanted to make a clean walk across the line without safety ropes for the camera. At sunrise, a small crew set up a 1-inch line about 120 feet long across a gap near the overlook. under park guidelines with required permits. They built 2 separate anchor systems using slings, bolts, and backup webbing, with edge protection at contact points. Tag lines kept the slack organized during setup. Most walkers attached a safety leash. Cole chose to go without one. Tourists began arriving as the sun came over the ridge. A park map sign moved slightly in a breeze that came and went. A handheld wind meter at the setup showed 6 to 10 miles per hour with occasional stronger gusts. The crew checked tension, checked knots, and checked the edge protection and leash snag checks at the anchors in case someone with a leash fell back into the rock. Cole walked back and forth at the start anchor in bare feet, wiping dust off his feet. He stood up, shook out his arms, and stepped onto the webbing. The line moved under him as lines normally do, with small waves from his weight and small waves from the air. He bent his knees and took slow steps, looking at the far anchor. The breeze pushed from his right side. He paused, let the motion settle, and kept moving. People watching held their breath without meaning to. A visitor with a camera later said it was quiet, except for wind and the small sound of the webbing. Halfway across, a stronger gust hit from the same direction. The line dipped and rolled a few inches. Cole lowered into a crouch to absorb the motion. He stood up again, took a step, and the line rolled a little more. A person watching from the overlook said Cole wobbled once, then twice, and the line moved out from under his foot. Cole tried to sit down on the line, but missed catching it and fell into open space. Without a safety leash, there was nothing to stop the fall. The crew at each anchor could only watch him fall past the cliff into open air. Park rangers were already in the area and called for more support. The overlook was cleared while a rescue team set up below. A helicopter was requested but canceled as ground teams moved into position. The response changed from rescue to recovery. Rangers took statements from the people who set up the line, nearby hikers, and the 2 closest tourists at the railing. The crew gave rangers the handheld wind readings and photos of the anchors before taking down the equipment. A ranger measured anchor positions, line length, and webbing type. The site was marked and photographed. By late afternoon, recovery teams reached the location below the cliff. The coroner documented the scene, and the body was transported out by ground crews. The park reopened the overlook with a ranger posted to answer questions and prevent copycat attempts. A week later, family and friends held a short memorial at the trailhead. They read from Cole's training notebook and placed webbing and a flower near the start point. A small service was held in Reno 2 days later. The National Park Service reviewed the event as an accidental fall. Rangers updated visitor information to stress the risks of walking high lines without safety ropes. The county coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Among local slackliners, the incident became a rule. Wind plus height increases risk without a safety leash. Crews added one more check to their routine. If wind stayed above single digits, they attached safety lines or packed up. It was September 10, 2015, in the Lauterbrunnen Valley, Switzerland. Clouds sat high over steep walls that dropped more than 2,000 feet to the meadows and a narrow road below. Daniel Price was 31 years old and worked as a software tester. He was taking time off from work. All summer, he had been flying clean lines in the mountains and keeping notes on wind, cloud base, and landmarks. He preferred steady plans over last-second choices and skipped exits that looked busy or gusty. He wanted one clean valley run before flying home. 2 friends hiked with him to the jumping spot just after sunrise. The air felt cool, and the wind at ground level moved the grass lightly. From the spot, they could see a big piece of rock that stuck out, then a line of trees on a slope. The plan was simple: fly left of the rock, go over the trees, and clear the road with plenty of room. They laid out the wingsuit and checked zippers, booties, and grippers. A small helmet-mounted camera recorded the exit and flight, and a small GPS logger sat under the suit. One friend stayed at the exit with a camera on his head. The other drove down and set a tripod at a pullout along the road to film from below. Cell coverage worked at the valley floor, so they kept a phone open for basic updates. Wind looked light. Leaves moved, but there were no strong gusts or swirling air in the nearby trees. The clouds stayed high and steady. Price practiced the path with his hands. A smooth push, quick speed up, then a slight left to miss the big rock and a gentle right to go over the trees. He clipped his visual altimeter to his wrist, set an audible in his helmet, and stepped to a known exit notch used by locals. Price pushed off cleanly and reached flight in seconds. From the camera at the ledge, his suit gained speed, and the valley opened under his path. He angled left toward the shoulder of rock. The line looked accurate and tight. As he crossed the big rock, the suit flew close to the wall. A small fix came late, and the path stayed near the stone longer than planned. From the field below, a farmer looked up at the sound of wind moving over fabric. The roadside camera showed a brief hit with rock, a change in direction, and then a crash out of view. His friend at the ledge called the friend at the road, who called emergency services. A rescue helicopter was requested. Mountain Rescue reached the slope first and coordinated with the helicopter crew. The site lay below the trees and above the road on a steep mix of dirt and loose rock. Teams set a safety perimeter and asked drivers to keep moving so the road wouldn't back up with onlookers. Police took statements from the two friends, the farmer, and two drivers who had pulled into the same roadside turnout as the tripod. The friend at the road handed over the tripod footage and the timestamps. The friend at the exit provided the helmet video and a copy of the GPS file. Weather notes from that morning were written in a pocket notebook and matched the light wind that locals reported. By early afternoon, rescue teams finished the recovery and moved equipment back to the road. The helicopter was sent away. Police marked the jumping spot, the flight path along the wall, and the area above the trees where the path changed. They measured distances so the pictures could be matched to the records later. The next week, Price's parents held a small cremation in their hometown. Co-workers joined by video and sent a simple wreath. His friends shared the last GPS track and said he had kept to the plan until the left-hand section near the buttress. Cantonal Police and Mountain Rescue documented the GPS, the weather notes, and both videos. Authorities reminded visitors that small errors at high speed leave no margin in tight terrain and asked wingsuit flyers to choose conservative lines when winds are not steady. The coroner listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Among flyers who use the valley, the run became a quiet example used in safety talks. Keep more room near rock, keep decisions simple, and if a line asks for perfect timing, treat it as a warning, not a goal. It was May 8, 2018, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Early morning light was low over a row of flat roofs, and morning moisture made the black tar wet and shiny. Marcus Hale was 23 years old and went to community college. He made roof running videos for a small channel. He worked nights at a cafe and trained on weekends. He practiced gap jumps in gyms first, using tape marks to measure takeoff and landing. He told friends this would be the last big one before finals week. At first light, Marcus and two friends went upstairs inside the building and pushed through a metal door. The roof was standard built-up tar and gravel with a low parapet about 18 inches high. Across the alley, the second roof sat about 4 feet lower with an 18-inch parapet. They measured the gap with a tape, roughly 11 feet across with a drop of about 4 feet to the landing surface. On camera, the space looked longer than it did in person. They set a phone on a small tripod and did walkthroughs. Rubber soles left light marks on damp tar. The run-up gave Marcus about 30 feet to build speed, plant, and lift. He scuffed his shoes on a rough patch for grip and wiped the takeoff spot with a towel, but the tar remained slick. Sirens sounded a few blocks away, and the group started rushing. One friend called out the count and held the frame. Marcus took 3 practice runs to mark his steps. On the 4th try, he ran harder, head level, arms set for swing. His plant foot hit the damp edge. The shoe slid a few inches, and the takeoff turned into a low, flat jump. He reached for the opposite wall, hit the edge with both hands, and could not hold on. His body swung and fell back into the gap. The two friends ran to the edge and looked down into the narrow space between buildings. One called 911 and gave the cross streets. The other went back through the door to reach the alley from the ground level. Police and fire units arrived soon after the call. An EMS crew took over and moved carefully in the tight space. Officers taped off the alley, set a safety perimeter, and kept people away. The phone and tripod were collected, and the friends gave their names. A supervisor asked the building manager to lock the roof door. Detectives spoke with a neighbor who heard the slide and with 2 workers who had been unloading a van nearby. The friends explained the plan and showed earlier gym videos on a second phone. They pointed out the wet tar and the towel at the takeoff spot. One detective walked out the run-up and the gap, wrote down the numbers, and took photos of both walls. By mid-morning, investigators finished their scene work. The coroner later listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Officers cleared the alley and returned the block to regular traffic. Building management replaced the temporary door latch with a lock and posted a notice warning against unauthorized access. The funeral took place that weekend at a neighborhood church, and the seats were full. His coach from the gym spoke for a few minutes about caution and skill. Police treated the case as a trespass-related accident with no sign of foul play. Building owners added locked doors and new warning signs, and the property manager sent a memo to tenants about roof access and safety. In the small parkour community nearby, the video turned into a training note rather than a clip to share. Coaches repeated 3 points in classes the next week. Do a dry run on dry ground. Do not rush a takeoff when the surface is wet. And measure more than you trust what a camera shows. The block settled back to its routine, but the damp marks at the takeoff spot stayed visible for a day, a plain reminder of how a few inches of slip can change a jump that looked simple on paper. It was June 20th, 2015, at a county fairgrounds in Ohio. A vintage 2-seat biplane sat near the show line, while a wing-walking setup with simple handholds and a tethered harness was checked one more time. Claire Mason was 37 years old and worked as a stunt performer. She had trained for years on older biplanes. She practiced low, straight passes and simple moves and kept her actions tight and repeatable. She cared about timing, handholds, and clear safety calls with the pilot. The pilot that day had the proper ratings and was known among show crews for smooth, steady controls. Mid-afternoon heat pushed temperatures near 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which means the hot, thin air makes wings and engines work less well. A large crowd lined the fence. On Claire's signal, the pilot brought the biplane down the runway for a flat pass to check power and control, then set up for the move that showed her moving from the center section toward the right wing. Before the move, the crew checked radio connections, safety rope clips, and hand signals. A light breeze moved across the field at about 6 to 8 miles per hour. The pilot began a climb to give room, then started a shallow turn so the crowd could see Claire's movement from the side. The airplane's nose came up as the speed dropped for the act. Claire stepped from the center post to the right wing area she had practiced many times. The pilot held a very slight bank and added power, but the hot air meant there was less lift than on cooler days. From the fence line, the airplane looked slow and nose high, with the upper wing blocking part of the body from view. A person with a video camera near midfield said later the plane stalled, then dropped like a door. The biplane shook, rolled toward the field, and came down in a steep path from a few hundred feet above the ground. The right wingtip hit first, followed by the nose and lower gear. A brief spray of dirt and parts marked the impact spot, inside the safety area and well away from the crowd. Show staff waved people back and used cones to widen the clear zone while emergency crews moved in. Fire and EMS units from the fairgrounds detail reached the site within moments. Fuel and battery switches were made safe, and fire equipment stood by as medics checked both people. Deputies and air show operations staff pushed the crowd line back and suspended the show. The field was closed and a temporary command post was set up near a hangar. Deputies took statements from witnesses, including the person with the video camera and photographers. The show's safety officer provided the pilot's paperwork and aircraft registration. A weather printout showed the temperature and pressure readings that explained the higher density altitude. By late afternoon, the coroner documented the scene and arranged transport. The wreckage was marked and guarded overnight. The next morning, investigators took custody for detailed examination, beginning with the engine, propeller, and controls. In the days that followed, they gathered engine data, maintenance logs, pilot records, and weather information. Video from several angles was also reviewed, with the focus on airspeed management and climb performance in the afternoon heat. The coroner listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death for both people. A joint memorial honored both Claire and the pilot at the airfield the following weekend. Flowers were placed at the edge of the runway. Aviation officials paused low-altitude stunt waivers at the venue and reminded airshow organizers to factor density altitude into show routines on hot days. It was April 16, 2018, near Page, Arizona. A plywood takeoff ramp faced a narrow desert cut in the ground, made of hard clay and sand. Ryan Cole was 35 years old and worked as a mechanic. He built bikes in his garage and rode at local stunt nights. He measured ramps with a tape and level, marked run-ups with chalk, and checked engine settings twice before shows. He told friends this one was a short gap for the hometown crowd. His partner had warned him about the wind that morning. The cut in the ground was roughly 12 feet deep and about 30 to 35 feet across. The takeoff ramp stood about 4 feet high, built with lumber and covered with plywood. Across the gap, a landing pile of packed dirt rose a few feet above the far bank. A friend set up a camera on the landing side. By late morning, gusts pushed dust across the run-up. A handheld meter showed about 10 miles per hour with higher crosswind gusts. Ryan walked the run-up and wiped the ramp face with a towel, but fine dust and grit remained. He marked his steps with chalk, then rolled the bike back to a mark that gave him about 120 feet of run-up. He did 2 speed checks, rolling on and off the gas to feel the pull. The engine sounded clean on the straight, but coughed once when he revved at the bottom of the ramp. He pointed at the engine part, made a quick mixture change, and took one more pass. Sirens sounded from the highway, a mile away. The friend on the pile called that the camera was ready. Ryan went around, lined up, and opened the gas. The bike went straight on the hard ground. At the bottom of the ramp, he gave a final gas boost. The motor hesitated. The front wheel dipped as speed fell short. He reached the edge. The bike hesitated again, and the jump went flat. A security guard from a nearby business said later it sounded wrong at takeoff, like it lost breath. The front wheel hit the far edge of the cut. The bike tipped forward and fell into the cut. A dust cloud rose from the bottom. The friend on the pile ran to the edge and called 911, giving mile markers and a nearby crossroad. The guard moved cars back and kept people behind the cones. A deputy arrived first, followed by a fire unit and EMS. Crews went down into the cut with a backboard and secured the scene. The deputy noted wind conditions, ramp location, and distances with a laser measure. Investigators photographed the ramp face, chalk marks, and tire tracks. They measured the gap at 33 feet from edge to edge and recorded the run-up length and ramp height. The friend provided the camera card. The guard gave his statement. The deputy spoke with Ryan's partner, who confirmed the earlier warning about wind. After EMS confirmed fatal injuries, the coroner was notified. By early afternoon, the scene was cleared. The coroner documented the location and arranged transport. The deputy tagged the ramp and the bike as evidence and then released the scene to the property owner. A teardown of the motorcycle at Ryan's garage found a lean condition at throttle tip-in, matching the bog witnesses heard at the ramp. The cause of death was listed by the coroner as blunt force trauma. The funeral drew riders from 3 towns. His partner spoke briefly about patience and leaving projects unfinished. Deputies cited members of the crew for trespass and unsafe assembly on private land. The county later issued guidance on event permits and placed barriers to block access to that cut for future stunts. Within the local riding scene, the video became a training note rather than a clip to share. Riders repeated 3 points the next week. Test throttle response underload. Do not launch with dust on the face. And call it off if wind hits double digits with gusts. It was March 3, 2016, in Helsinki, Finland, and the winter evening was quiet. The streets were damp from melting snow, and neon signs reflected off the wet pavement. In the Kallio district, a small fitness center was closing for the night. Jukka Lehtinen, a 52-year-old gym owner known for strict discipline, had spent decades in the fitness business. He was tough on his staff and often called out their mistakes in front of members. His style was old school and unforgiving. A few weeks earlier, he had a heated clash with one of his trainers, Kari Niemi. During a busy session, Jukka accused him of being careless with equipment and unprofessional with clients. He raised his voice and pointed his finger while members watched from nearby machines. The confrontation embarrassed Carey in front of everyone. His face flushed red as he tore off his staff shirt and walked out. He left the gym that day and told others he would never forgive Yuka for what had happened. Yuka followed the same routine every night, and Carey knew it well. After the last members left, Yuka always ended his shift with a solo sauna session. Same pattern, same time, like clockwork. Carey still had a spare key that he never returned. One evening, he slipped inside after hours. The gym was empty and silent. He moved to the sauna's control box and disabled the automatic shutoff that kept the heat from climbing too high. Then he wedged the outside latch with a metal shim so the door could not be opened from inside. He tested it once to make sure it held. Satisfied, he left quietly through the back exit. The following night, Yuka followed his routine. Around 10 p.m., he walked through the locker room with a towel over his shoulder and stepped into the sauna. A cleaner sweeping the hall noticed him enter. At first, nothing seemed wrong. 10 minutes later, the cleaner walked past again and paused. Thick steam was rolling under the door. From inside came dull thumps, heavy and uneven. The cleaner thought Yuka was shifting on the bench or tossing water onto the hot rocks, but the sound sharpened, like fists striking wood. He called out but got no response. The cleaner tugged at the handle, but the latch would not move. It felt jammed tight. Worried, he rushed to the supply closet and grabbed a metal bar used for weight racks. His hands shook as he searched through the shelves. By the time he returned with another staff member, the pounding had stopped. Together, they forced the latch open. The door groaned and then swung outward. A wave of heat surged into the hall, thick and choking. Inside, the benches were soaked. Steam clung to every surface, and the air burned to breathe. Yuka was collapsed on the middle bench, motionless. His skin was flushed a deep red, and his towel was darkened at the edges. Later checks showed the sauna had climbed past 220 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond safe limits. The cleaner backed away in shock. The room was so hot that they could not stand inside for more than a few seconds. What was once a place of calm had turned into a furnace. Investigators arrived later that night. They found the safety timer had been tampered with and the latch jammed from the outside. It was not a simple malfunction. Someone had prepared the trap. Tool marks on the control box matched wrenches missing from the locker Kari Niemi once used, and his spare key was recovered during a search of his apartment. He was arrested within days, and the case was ruled a calculated act of revenge. The gym closed for a week. Members spoke in hushed voices about the owner who lost his life in the very place he trusted most. It was September 12, 2015, in Tuscany, Italy, and the hillsides were quiet as evening settled. The air was heavy with the smell of grapes during harvest season. On the edge of Chianti country, a small vineyard was prepared for another long night of work. Running this estate was Paolo Ricci, a 61-year-old co-owner who had spent his life building the family business. Paolo was known for his sharp business sense and stubborn decisions. He ran the vineyard with an iron grip and rarely backed down from a fight. Earlier that year, he forced his cousin, Marco Ricci, out of the partnership after a bitter dispute over finances. Paolo claimed Marco had been mismanaging funds and making poor choices that hurt the business. Many workers whispered that Marco had taken the loss hard. For decades, he had labored in the same fields alongside Paolo, only to watch his name removed from contracts and his influence stripped away. He rarely spoke to the family after the split, but people noticed him walking the edge of the vineyard rows more than once, watching in silence from a distance. Marco knew the property better than anyone. He also knew the dangers inside the underground wine cellar. The sealed stone room held fermenting barrels that released carbon dioxide, a gas heavier than air. If trapped inside without proper ventilation, the buildup could suffocate a person within minutes. Marco had helped design the cellar years earlier, and he remembered every latch, every vent, and every corner. That knowledge became the center of his plan for revenge. On a late summer evening, Marco returned to the estate under the cover of darkness. The harvest kept everyone distracted in the fields, their voices carrying across the rows. He carried a small tube of industrial glue and slipped into the cellar corridor. The heavy oak door had a simple latch, one that could be sealed quickly by forcing a thin bead of glue directly into the mechanism. He coated it carefully, working slowly to avoid making noise. Then he waited for his chance. That night, Marco approached Paolo with a calm suggestion. The barrels, he said, might be over-fermenting. He urged Paolo to check them before morning or risk losing an entire batch. To a man like Paolo, whose pride rested on the quality of his wine, such a warning could not be ignored. Paolo trusted his own judgment above all and decided to inspect the cellar himself. A field hand later recalled seeing Paolo descend into the cellar around midnight, a lantern in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The worker thought nothing of it until some time passed and faint banging came from behind the door. The sound was weak, as though muffled by thick stone walls. When the worker tried the latch, it refused to turn. It was stuck solid. The worker called for help. Others arrived and tried forcing the door, but the latch would not budge. The banging grew less frequent, then stopped. No one knew how long Paolo had struggled inside, surrounded by the invisible gas rising from the barrels. The lantern's glow faded until the cellar returned to silence. By dawn, worried workers gathered in the corridor. They pried at the latch with iron bars until the door splintered open. A rush of stale air spilled out. Inside, Paolo was slumped against the largest barrel, his lantern cold beside him. The air smelled strongly of fermenting grapes, sharp and suffocating. His face was drained of color, his body still. Investigators found the latch had been glued to the mechanism. Traces of the same industrial adhesive were traced to a tube Marco purchased in Siena weeks earlier, and a partial fingerprint in the dried glue matched his record. Confronted with the evidence, Marco admitted he had prepared the trap. He was arrested, and the case was ruled an act of revenge carried out with knowledge only a vintner could possess. The vineyard never stopped. Harvest continued that same week, though workers moved through the rows in silence. For them, the vines were no longer just a source of wine, but a reminder of how one family feud had ended in calculated death. It was July 18th, 2018, in Singapore, and the night air was warm and heavy. Rain from earlier in the evening still clung to the streets, and the glow from streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. At the edge of the central district, the main city library was winding down for the day. Running this busy facility was Daniel Wong, a 44-year-old head librarian known for being methodical, keeping the building's operations running with strict routines and careful oversight. Earlier that year, safety checks revealed repeated problems with the elevators and other systems. The library's maintenance supervisor, Lee Han, had been warned several times to keep up with inspections, but failed to file reports on time. After several missed deadlines, Daniel dismissed him from his position. Lee left the job quietly, but he carried years of technical knowledge of the building and a growing resentment toward the man who had forced him out. Lee knew the library building better than anyone. For years, he had handled its mechanical systems, including the service elevators used by staff to move supplies between floors. He knew every override panel, every interlock, and every shut-off switch hidden in the service corridors. He understood how the safety systems worked and how they could be disabled. Losing his job did not take away that knowledge, and it was that knowledge he would later use for revenge. On a quiet evening, weeks later, Lee entered the library's service area after hours. Using an old access code he had never returned, he bypassed the electronic lock and slipped into the narrow corridor behind the staff elevators. The hallway was dim and silent, lit only by a single emergency light. There, he disabled the safety interlock that prevented elevators from moving when maintenance was underway. He also bypassed the kill switch designed to keep the cab stationary when someone was on top of it. He worked carefully, making sure each wire was disconnected in a way that would not trigger an alarm. The trap was set. He left the building the same way he came in, unnoticed. The next morning, Lee phoned the library's service desk from a prepaid mobile phone. He reported that one of the staff lifts was jammed between floors and acting strangely. Daniel, known for being hands-on and unwilling to wait for outside help, decided to inspect it himself before calling for professional repair. He grabbed a flashlight from his office and headed toward the dim corridor leading to the service shaft. A junior staffer later recalled seeing Daniel step into the narrow passage, his flashlight beam cutting across the concrete walls. The staffer heard him muttering about checking the car roof for a mechanical fault. He said something about it probably being a loose cable or misaligned sensor. Moments later, the service elevator groaned and began to rise, even though no call button had been pressed. The movement was slow at first, then faster. A sudden shout echoed inside the shaft. The staffer froze in place, unsure of what was happening. Then came a metallic clatter, the sound of Daniel's flashlight striking the concrete floor below. By the time the worker reached the doorway and looked inside, the sounds had already gone silent. The elevator had stopped moving. When others arrived and the power was cut to the system, the elevator was found pressed tight against the top of the shaft. Daniel had climbed onto the cab roof to inspect the mechanism and was pinned in the narrow ceiling space above, his body wedged between steel and concrete. There had been less than a foot of clearance. The damage was instant and fatal. Investigators discovered the interlock had been manually bypassed and the kill switch disabled. Security footage showed a man entering the service corridor the night before using an old access code. His build and gait matched Lee Han, the former supervisor. In his apartment, police later found tools coated with grease from the library's elevator system and printouts of the building's mechanical diagrams. He was arrested within a week, and the case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with technical precision. It was May 30th, 2015, in Key Largo, Florida, and the morning was clear and calm. The water was flat inside the reef line, and charter boats idled along the channel. On a small dive boat tied off near a coral wall, students listened to a short briefing before their first descent. Leading the group was Mark Grant, a 32-year-old scuba instructor at a small neighborhood dive club. Mark worked year-round teaching entry-level classes. In the weeks before the dive, rumors spread that he had started seeing the girlfriend of one of the club's advanced divers. The rival was older, bitter, and had keys to the gear shed from past volunteer work. He knew the equipment well, where the compressors were and which tanks Mark used. Mark's cylinders were easy to spot with his initials stenciled near the boot. Late one night, the rival unlocked the storage cage and rolled Mark's favorite tank to the bench near the compressor room. He cracked the valve to bleed it down to zero, then clipped a whip from a tall supply bottle and refilled the cylinder with pure nitrogen. He set the pressure to normal, about 3,000 psi, so the gauge would look right in the morning. He wiped the tank with a rag, returned it to the rack, and locked the cage behind him. The swap took only minutes. There was no analyzer on the club table because the class was using standard air, not nitrox. No one would think to test it. The next day, the group prepared for a training dive to 40 feet along a coral wall. Mark checked his gear on the boat deck. He opened his valve, checked his pressure, and took a few breaths from the regulator. Everything seemed normal. Nitrogen feels no different until you're under pressure. The hiss was clean, the gauge read full. The group descended in pairs. An eyewitness student said Mark led at the front, a few yards above the sand. 5 minutes into the dive, his movements changed. He reached for the line but missed. His kicks became erratic. His eyes appeared glassy behind the mask, and his movements lost coordination. He fumbled with his regulator, and it slipped from his mouth. Bubbles frosted his mask as it flooded. A diver next to him tried to donate air with an octopus regulator, but Mark did not bite down. His hands were slow and uncoordinated, moving as though he could not understand what was happening. In seconds, he went limp. The assistant diver grabbed his harness and began a controlled ascent, kicking hard toward the surface. But the class had spread out along the reef. 2 more students surfaced early in a panic, waving at the boat and shouting for help. The captain threw a tagline and radioed for emergency help. When the crew rolled Mark over the transom, he was unresponsive. Another dive boat had sent down a rescue diver to help lift him from the bottom after he began to sink. That diver later said only Mark's gear looked wrong. Everyone else returned, breathing hard but normal. Back at the dock, the club quarantined the equipment. The sheriff's office sealed the cylinder and took it for testing. The gas analysis told the story. The seized tank showed no measurable oxygen, only nitrogen. The other students' cylinders, sampled from the same fill batch, tested as normal compressed air at roughly 21% oxygen. The problem was not the compressor or the boat. It was a single tank. Investigators pulled the shop's entry logs and camera clips from the alley behind the gear shed. The night before the dive, the rival's key fob opened the cage just before 10:45 p.m. A security camera caught his truck backing up to the side door and his silhouette moving across the compressor room window. In his garage, deputies found a valve wrench with fresh tool marks and a partially drained industrial nitrogen bottle used for gas blending. His phone showed a late-night search for an oxygen analyzer, not required for air. Confronted with the test results and the entry logs, he admitted he had swapped a tank to teach him a lesson. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with simple knowledge of scuba equipment. The club padlocked its gear shed and posted a sign on the counter: analyzers required for any personal cylinders. Word spread fast along the Florida Keys. Divers talked quietly about how a normal gauge reading and a familiar hiss could still hide an empty breath. It was November 6th, 2015, in London, and the rain had just cleared from the West End streets. Inside the Harrington Playhouse, rehearsals were underway on the dim stage. Among the cast was Simon Gray, a 26-year-old understudy who had recently been promoted to a lead role. Simon had stepped in after the original actor, Edward Price, left in anger. Edward had been vocal about losing the part, arguing with directors and crew before storming out. Though dismissed, he still knew the theater well. Before acting, Edward had worked stagehand jobs where he learned the ropes, pulleys, and counterweight systems that moved curtains and backdrops. That knowledge would later become the means of his revenge. The counterweight system used in the Harrington Playhouse was old but effective. Sandbags balanced the heavy curtains and scenery flats, allowing a single person to raise or lower them. Each weight was stitched in canvas and stacked neatly in the fly loft above the stage. In the dark, they all looked the same. Edward knew he could tamper with one without raising suspicion. On a quiet night before rehearsal, he entered through a side door using the access card he still had. Stagehands often left latches loose, so no one noticed he was inside. He located the set of weights assigned to the main curtain and removed one sandbag. In its place, he hung a look-alike sack filled not with sand, but a solid concrete block weighing nearly 80 pounds. He stitched the canvas tight to hide the shape, brushed dust across the seams, and returned the line to its original position. To the eye, nothing looked unusual. To the hand, the weight felt the same on the rope until it dropped. The following afternoon, the cast gathered for rehearsal. The house lights were dimmed, and only the stage lamps burned. Simon stood at the wing, following cues with the script tucked under one arm. As part of his entrance, he needed to pull the curtain line. Several actors nearby remembered watching him step to the rope, plant his feet, and give it a firm tug. At first, the curtain shifted normally. Then came the sound of a rope hissing through pulleys, followed by a sharp crack overhead. Before anyone could react, the disguised counterweight plunged. It fell straight down the guide track and struck Simon on the top of his head with enough force to collapse him instantly to the stage. His script scattered across the boards as he dropped. One castmate shouted in panic while others froze in silence. A thin cloud of plaster dust drifted from the rafters, stirred loose by the jolt of the falling block. Stagehands who had been adjusting lights rushed forward but stopped short at the sight. The block rolled once before settling, its canvas cover torn to reveal gray concrete beneath. The rehearsal ended in chaos. Someone called for emergency services, while others gathered in small, stunned groups near the footlights. The theater went silent, except for the hum of the old lamps overhead. Investigators later examined the rigging. The weights were cataloged, and only one was abnormal. Tests confirmed the block weighed nearly double the normal counterweight. Security checks revealed Edward's access card had been used at the side door the night before, long after official crew hours. When officers searched his flat, they found stitching tools, leftover canvas, and traces of powdered cement on his workbench. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a deliberate act of sabotage carried out with knowledge only an insider would possess. It was August 21st, 2017, in Santa Monica, California, and the boardwalk was quiet after midnight. Inside the amusement park, the rides were dark except for scattered service lights. The only machine running was the Thunder Drop roller coaster, a steel track that wound through tunnels and sharp curves. Maintenance crews often sent cars through test runs before opening or after repairs. Running this section was Marcus Allen, a 35-year-old senior ride operator. Marcus had worked the coaster for years and was trusted to oversee safety checks. He also had a reputation among staff for being harsh with junior workers. Several trainees had filed complaints about his bullying, but supervisors rarely acted on them. One of those complaints came from Leah Ramos, a seasonal employee who eventually quit. Her concerns went unanswered, but her brother Ethan worked nearby and had access to maintenance diagrams of the coaster. He studied the track, noting where a blind tunnel passed close to a service platform. That section, hidden from the main midway, became central to his plan. On a night when inspections were scheduled, Ethan entered the service area with a length of steel cable. He stretched it across the tunnel opening at neck height, fastening it tightly to anchor points on either side. The dim bulbs inside the tunnel gave little reflection, and from the front seat of a speeding car, the cable would be almost invisible. Once set, he left through a staff exit. The cable remained taut, waiting. Later that night, Marcus prepared for a routine single-car test run. A janitor working nearby saw him unlock the gate, step into the loading bay, and settle into the front seat. With no passengers and no fanfare, the restraints clicked shut. The car rolled forward, gathering speed as it climbed the first hill. The sound of wheels rattled up the incline and disappeared into the structure. Moments later, the janitor paused his sweeping. The usual echoes of the ride, the roar of descent, and the screech of turns were cut short. Instead, there was a sudden silence, broken only by the ocean wind. Minutes passed until the car coasted slowly back into the station. Marcus sat slumped in the seat. His upper body leaned forward, unmoving. Across his neck was a severe laceration, the cut running straight across. The janitor, stunned, later told investigators he noticed a brief glint inside the tunnel before hearing a sharp snap. The cable had broken loose after the strike, one end dangling from the platform rail. The test run was halted immediately. Park security sealed the coaster and kept workers back. Maintenance crews examined the tunnel and found the remnants of the steel line still bolted at one end, the other frayed from force. Investigators traced the tampering to tool marks, matching wrenches found in Ethan Ramos's garage. Records showed he had obtained the blueprints months earlier through a contractor friend. He was arrested within a week. The case was ruled a calculated act of revenge carried out with precision inside the hidden structure of the ride. The Thunder Drop stayed locked behind steel gates. For weeks, locals walked past the coaster in silence, knowing the ride that once brought excitement had become the stage for a killing disguised as a test. It was October 3rd, 2015, in Brooklyn, New York. The narrow alleys of Bushwick were quiet in the early morning. The streets seemed calm, but above them, a single decision set off a chain of moments that neighbors would remember long after the night ended. Victor Ramirez, 29, worked long hours in kitchens across the borough. He washed dishes at a diner in the mornings and took a second shift at a bar in the evenings. His income kept him afloat, but left little margin. Friends described him as confident to the point of carelessness, someone who enjoyed pushing limits. In his free time, he liked demonstrating balance tricks, walking laundry lines behind buildings, or climbing onto roofs where others hesitated to go. The rooftops in his neighborhood offered shortcuts between blocks, and Victor had turned them into his own path home. The buildings were mostly old brick walk-ups, patched with tar and flashing. Lines of cable, pipes, and rusted rails crisscrossed the gaps between structures. They were never meant to bear weight, but Victor saw them as an alternative to staircases and sidewalks. He had shown friends his route before, laughing at the danger. To him, it was routine, but it depended entirely on luck and grip. That night, he finished his second shift just after 2 a.m. and left with a coworker. Instead of following him down the stairs to the street, Victor led him up to the roof access door. The plan was to cross between buildings rather than circle around the block. A tensioned utility line stretched between two rooftops, fixed to rooftop hardware. It sagged slightly from years of tension, narrow and slick from condensation. The coworker, used to Victor's shortcuts, leaned casually against the wall and waited, unaware that the air carried a damp chill that made every surface just a little less forgiving. The first steps went smoothly. He crouched low, arms out, moving slowly along the cable. His shoes pressed into the thin steel, which flexed slightly under his weight. At the halfway point, the cable twitched, shifting against its anchors. The motion threw off his rhythm. The coworker later described how Victor froze, then bent his knees deeper to regain stability. For a moment, it looked as if he might recover, but his arms flailed as the cable oscillated. Witnesses on the street below heard a brief yell, followed by the heavy sound of impact. Victor had slipped forward, his body twisting as he lost grip. He struck the pavement of the narrow alley head first, the collision leaving him motionless. Blood pooled beneath his head, where he struck the pavement. The coworker rushed down the stairs screaming for help, but there was little anyone could do. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes, securing the area with tape while neighbors leaned from windows. Victor was pronounced dead at the scene. The fall distance, about 30 feet, had caused massive blunt force trauma. No drugs were found on him, though investigators noted alcohol in his system, consistent with his shift ending at a bar. An autopsy later confirmed his cause of death as a skull fracture with associated brain trauma. In the days following, locals remembered him as daring but reckless. Friends admitted they had seen him take similar shortcuts many times, calling it only a matter of time. Authorities classified the death as an accident, noting that rooftop crossings were not uncommon in the neighborhood, but remained extremely unsafe. Victor Ramirez's case was closed within a week. No further action was taken, but property owners in the area reinforced access doors to discourage similar incidents. It was June 18, 2016, in London, United Kingdom. The summer air was bright and clear, company banners flapping lightly above a courtyard where staff gathered for a charity event. The setting was festive, but behind the cheers and music, one participant's overconfidence would turn the day into an incident that left colleagues shaken. Melissa Carter, 37, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized financial services firm. She had built a reputation inside the office for her sharp competitiveness and frequent belittling of others. Colleagues described her as ambitious and abrasive, someone who sought to prove superiority whenever possible. Outside of work, she had no history in athletics, yet she enjoyed showcasing boldness in social settings. For Melissa, the fundraiser presented less a chance to support a cause than an opportunity to assert dominance over peers. The event featured a series of games and challenges on the company grounds, staged to raise money for a local hospital. Staff volunteers had arranged simple activities, including a low balance beam for participants to walk across while co-workers cheered. For safety, optional nets and mats were provided. The terrain itself was controlled, a flat courtyard with temporary scaffolding and platforms assembled for the demonstrations. It was intended to be a light-hearted environment, requiring no special training. When Melissa's turn came, she rejected the balance beam entirely. She insisted a rope be strung between two scaffolding posts at a height of about 15 feet. Her co-workers objected, pointing out that the stunt was unnecessary and riskier than anything planned. Safety mats and a net were offered, but she dismissed them, calling those who used them weak. The request was not part of the schedule, but under pressure, a few staff reluctantly improvised, tying a rope taut between the posts. From the ground, the rope swayed lightly in the breeze, thinner and less stable than anything meant for this type of performance. As she climbed the scaffolding, co-workers exchanged uneasy looks. Some suggested stopping the attempt, but Melissa waved them off, smirking as she positioned herself at the edge. With dozens of eyes on her, she stepped onto the rope. For a few seconds, she appeared steady, one foot in front of the other, arms extended for balance. Staff clapped half-heartedly, but the atmosphere carried more tension than celebration. Halfway across, the rope shifted beneath her shoe. Witnesses later described how her expression changed instantly from smug confidence to alarm. She slipped sideways, grabbing at the rope to catch herself. The force twisted her wrist sharply, leaving her hanging for barely a second before gravity took control. She fell hard against the scaffolding frame, her torso striking the metal crossbar with full weight before she hit the ground below. The impact was loud enough to draw gasps from the crowd. Several witnesses recalled the thud and the way her body folded on contact, convinced it meant broken ribs and internal damage. Blood spread from her mouth as her lungs filled, visible even to those at the back of the courtyard. Several staff members rushed forward, while others turned away. Her chest showed no normal movement, and the blood in her airway left little doubt of catastrophic trauma. But panic drove the event's first aid team to begin chest compressions anyway. Emergency services arrived within minutes, called by one of the staff. Yet by the time she was loaded into the ambulance, she was unresponsive. Melissa Carter was pronounced dead at the hospital that same afternoon. In the following weeks, bitterness outweighed sympathy. Many employees openly remarked that Melissa's arrogance had caused her own death, and some admitted they felt little grief over the outcome. While a small plaque was installed in the office lobby, it was largely ignored, with several staff privately calling it undeserved. It was September 9th, 2017, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The historic plaza was alive with music and dancing as the annual fiesta reached its evening peak. Lanterns flickered against the adobe walls, and the air carried a blend of roasted chile and beer. Crowds pressed around the stage, unaware that the night's energy would be broken by a miscalculation that ended in disaster. Antonio Delgado was 51, a lifelong resident of Santa Fe, known for his woodworking and deep ties to local cultural events. He had earned modest recognition at community fairs for carving furniture in traditional Spanish colonial style. He was known to be proud, stubborn, and prone to drinking heavily at public gatherings. Antonio saw the fiesta not only as heritage, but as a stage to prove himself. Risk did not deter him. If anything, it amplified his sense of bravado. In earlier years, he volunteered for demonstrations, carving, knotting, storytelling, but lately pushed for more daring displays. The rope walk was one of these, drawn from folklore rather than history. Without sponsors or proper gear, he improvised. 2 poles braced in sand-filled barrels and a hemp rope strung between them, with only the brick plaza below. That evening, after hours of drinking, Antonio declared he would perform the rope walk in front of the stage. Onlookers attempted to dissuade him, pointing out the instability of the setup and his unsteady condition. Festival staff were occupied with scheduled performers and allowed him space, assuming it would amount to little more than showmanship. Antonio, bottle still in hand, climbed onto the makeshift platform. The rope sagged under his weight, visibly uneven, but he treated the instability as part of the display. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he steadied himself, muttering that he could handle it. A few clapped hesitantly, though the majority watched in tense silence. Each step sent the rope bouncing, his shoes slipping slightly against the fibers. Witnesses described him shifting his arms in wide arcs, more to keep balance than to perform. From below, the sway of his body was erratic, his coordination evidently dulled by alcohol. About a third of the way across, his foot slipped sharply. He lurched sideways, the bottle slipping from his grip as his free arm scraped along the rope. The crowd gasped as he toppled into open air, his body twisting toward the edge of the plaza. The fall ended in seconds. He landed hard among the spectators, his wrist slamming against a stone bench with a crack audible even through the music. His head struck the plaza bricks immediately after, producing a hollow, unmistakable sound. Witnesses close to the impact described blood pooling almost instantly, spreading across the uneven stones. Shouts of panic cut through the festival music as people backed away. Volunteers forced through the crowd and laid him flat, a few trying compressions while others stood back. Paramedics arrived within minutes from a nearby staging area, but Antonio never regained consciousness. Despite their efforts, the combined head and chest trauma was irreversible, and he was pronounced dead within the hour at a local hospital. The fiesta was halted for about 20 minutes as organizers cleared the plaza and calmed the crowd. Music eventually returned, though in a restrained, uneasy rhythm that never recaptured the earlier energy. Vendors reported slower business than usual, with many families leaving earlier than planned. By the following day, the atmosphere of the celebration was described as muted, with conversations repeatedly circling back to the spectacle that had overshadowed the night. It was October 22nd, 2016, in Toronto, Canada. The air outside carried the chill of late fall, but inside an abandoned warehouse, the quiet was broken by the hum of camera equipment and scattered voices. A group of film students were working on a scene they hoped would impress jurors at an upcoming student festival. But by night's end, their project would be overshadowed by a fatal accident. Ethan Marsh was 25, a third-year film student with a reputation for chasing authenticity over safety. He had grown up on action movies, studying the raw energy of practical stunts, and believed audiences could always spot a fake. Classmates described him as abrasive, often dismissing suggestions he saw as timid. He wanted recognition, not just as a director, but as someone willing to risk himself for realism. Sponsors and faculty offered no funding for this project. Ethan scraped together equipment rentals through savings and student credit. The warehouse offered the kind of gritty backdrop he favored: exposed steel beams, concrete floors, and high windows leaking late daylight. For Ethan, the environment was a stage. The scene called for a chase, one character escaping by sprinting across a rope suspended high above the floor. Commercial crews would have built platforms, nets, and safety harnesses. Ethan had none of these. His classmates objected, suggesting camera tricks or editing cheats, but he dismissed them. He insisted the shot would only work if the actor, in this case himself, crossed the rope without precautions. That Saturday, they carried in a heavy coil of rope and fixed it between 2 parallel steel beams about 18 feet off the ground. The knots were rushed, pulled tight, but without professional rigging hardware. Classmates suggested lowering the setup or using a balance beam on the ground, but Ethan waved it off. With the daylight fading, he was more concerned about losing the look he wanted than about safety. As the cameras rolled, tension built. The crew shifted uneasily, waiting for Ethan to climb. He mounted one of the beams using a ladder, positioning himself with the rope stretched taut in front of him. The rope sagged slightly under his weight before he even placed both feet on it. One crew member muttered that it didn't look secure. Ethan steadied himself, spread his arms, and called for the take to begin. However, almost immediately through his first step, the rope twisted unexpectedly. Witnesses later recalled the sound of fibers straining as Ethan crouched, trying to regain balance. He grinned at the cameras and mouthed something, then shifted forward. But the second step proved fatal. His shoe slipped on the rope's fraying surface, and his body pitched sideways. The fall lasted only a moment. From nearly 20 feet up, he landed hard on his back with a dull thud that echoed through the warehouse. At first, he tried to breathe, but his chest barely rose, and within seconds, his body went limp. Crew members screamed and dropped equipment, rushing to him as it became clear he was unresponsive. Attempts at resuscitation began immediately, the urgency rising when he failed to respond to chest compressions. A stagehand grabbed a phone and dialed emergency services while others cleared space around him. Paramedics arrived within minutes, noting a faint pulse and believing at first he might survive, since there were no obvious external injuries. They worked quickly to stabilize him before rushing him to the hospital. Doctors fought to keep him alive for several hours, but the internal bleeding could not be controlled. He was pronounced dead later that evening in the trauma unit, the autopsy later confirming a partial tear of the aorta as the cause. Police questioned the crew, but determined the event accidental, citing lack of safety protocols and alcohol-free conditions. In the aftermath, the project collapsed. The footage, including the moments leading to Ethan's fall, was seized by faculty and placed under lock, deemed too disturbing to be used or screened. Several crew members withdrew from the film program entirely, shaken by the experience and unwilling to continue. It was June 30th, 2018, in Key West, Florida. The harbor lights flickered across the dark water, casting unsteady reflections between boats swaying in the humid night air. By midnight, the mood shifted from celebration to recklessness, and what began as a harmless dare would unravel into something irreversible. Todd Jenkins, 32, had worked for years as a yacht mechanic in Monroe County. His reputation on the docks was built on speed and strength. He could strip and repair an engine faster than most, and he was known for pushing limits off the clock as well. Nights usually ended in bars, where he picked fights or pulled stunts to prove himself tougher than anyone else. Friends saw it as bravado covering frustration. Todd drank heavily, but he also craved an audience, especially when younger co-workers began mocking him as past his prime. Risk, for him, was never separate from pride. Though not tied to any sponsors or organizations, his life revolved around Key West's marina culture. Mechanics, captains, and crew all shared the same bars and boats, their reputations carried by word of mouth. Todd lived for attention in that small circle. The environment itself fed his impulses. Boats with slick decks, jagged cleats, and heavy gear made for both a workplace and a playground when alcohol blurred judgment. He had walked dock railings before, balancing while friends cheered, but never under the glow of a party boat filled with strangers. That night's charter began like any other. The group drank rum while a stereo blasted classic rock. Todd had already downed several cups before he tied a thick rope between the boat's bow railing and a wooden piling at the dock. The makeshift bridge sagged with tension, but he insisted he would cross it like a pirate, his shirt off, sweat shining under floodlights. Passengers laughed nervously. Some cheered him on, while others warned the rope was slick and unstable. The captain objected but didn't intervene, distracted by keeping the boat steady against the dock and the tide. Todd stepped onto the rope barefoot, his arms stretched wide for balance, body swaying with the pull of the line. Passengers crowded the bow, cell phones up, recording. The rope bounced with every step. He grinned, soaking in the attention, and staggered forward as if performing. Then his foot slipped against the wet line. He lurched sideways, arms flailing. Witnesses recalled him hitting the metal railing on his way down with a sharp thud before splashing into the black water below. At first, the crowd thought it was another stunt. Then blood spread quickly on the surface. He had slashed his wrist against a jagged cleat welded to the hull near the bow. In the floodlights, the water churned red. Todd thrashed, striking out with his good arm, but his movements weakened almost immediately. His head dipped under once, then again, longer each time. The music stopped, replaced by screams. Several passengers threw life rings, but the current pulled him just out of reach. The captain alerted the authorities. One man jumped in but struggled in the turbulence and was hauled back aboard. Within less than a minute, Todd's arm stopped moving. His body rolled once with the tide before disappearing under the boat. By the time the Coast Guard arrived, divers were needed to retrieve him. His body was found near the piling, limp and pale, wrist torn open, blood diluted into the harbor. The Coast Guard's report later cited alcohol, unsafe conditions, and disregard for warnings. No charges were filed against the crew or captain. The case was marked closed within days. Todd's funeral was held a week later at a small church in Key West. The pews filled mostly with dock workers, mechanics, and longtime locals. A handful of co-workers shared short memories of his skill in the shop, but few spoke of the night itself. For most, it was less a shock than a grim confirmation of where his habits had led. It was August 19, 2017, in Orlando, Florida. The theme park had just closed, the bright music silenced, and rides stilled, leaving the grounds in artificial twilight. Maintenance crews moved in behind the departing crowds, but in one corner of the park, a group of seasonal employees lingered where they should not have been. Brianna Lowell was 19, a seasonal hire working concessions and occasionally assigned to crowd control near rides. Friends knew her as bold and mocking of authority, often slipping into staff-only areas for thrills. She was restless, ambitious, and dismissive of rules, bragging that she would one day leave the job behind for something more exciting. Risk was part of her personality. Peer attention mattered. The area she entered was meant only for trained staff, service platforms, catwalks, and cables above heavy machinery. It was narrow, dimly lit, and crowded with beams, gears, and drive systems, all marked with warnings about crushing hazards. To Brianna, those signs looked more like dares. On that night, she and 4 friends slipped past a gate after closing. They gathered beneath the skeleton of a roller coaster, where floodlights cast sharp shadows over steel beams. Brianna spotted a thick service rope tied between 2 access points above a cluster of machinery. Laughing, she told the others she would walk across it. They urged her to stop, pointing out the drop in the gears below, but she waved them off. Alcohol, smuggled earlier in the shift, had lowered her judgment further. She climbed onto the rope, balancing barefoot. The line sagged under her weight, her arms spread wide as she inched forward. Her friends stood on the platform, torn between nervous laughter and genuine fear. The rope swayed with each movement. Halfway across, she turned her head to grin back at them. In that moment, her foot slipped against the rope's fibers and she fell. Her friends later described her striking a beam before plunging into the mechanical pit. She landed in the gears of an idle drive assembly and the force crushed her chest on impact. Her scream was short, cut off by the grinding sound of her body striking metal. One friend bolted toward security while the others fled, sobbing and panicked. Security staff arrived instantaneously, finding Brianna unresponsive, pinned awkwardly between beams. Blood had pooled beneath her and spread across the machinery. Her body was recovered only after maintenance workers disassembled part of the structure. The autopsy later confirmed massive blunt force trauma to the chest as the cause of death. Behind closed doors, security staff who witnessed the recovery admitted the scene was among the worst they had encountered. Details were withheld from the public, but among employees, the story circulated quietly as a reminder of how quickly recklessness could end in disaster. It was January 11th, 2016, on the upper slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. The thin night air bit against exposed skin, and the glow of headlamps stretched in a line toward the crater rim. Before sunrise at Stella Point, one climber's determination would cross into fatal misjudgment. Graham Vehemen was 36, a financial analyst from London. He lived by metrics, heart rates, split times, performance reviews. A weekend marathoner, he prided himself on efficiency and toughness, repeating to friends that pain was temporary, but persistence defined him. Climbing Kilimanjaro had been an office dare, a goal born from boasting, but he prepared by logging treadmill miles and occasional hill sprints. His colleagues Priya and Daniel joined partly for camaraderie, partly to measure themselves against him. The Mashame route was marketed as manageable for fit amateurs, but the reality was stark. Barafu Camp, the last staging point at 15,331 feet, left most struggling with headaches and shallow sleep. Climbers relied on layering, trekking poles, and guides trained to recognize danger signs. Supplemental oxygen was carried only for emergencies, while a portable hyperbaric chamber was considered best practice. Operators stressed pole, slow progress, to let the body adapt. But Graham saw slowness as weakness. The summit push began at midnight. At Kosovo Camp, 16,076 feet. His speech slurred and his gait faltered. Guide Joseph advised turning back, citing altitude sickness risk. Graham dismissed it, insisting he had endured worse. Priya followed uneasily behind, noticing his sway. The group moved upward. By 18,700 feet, Graham vomited, wiped his mouth, and forced a grin. Then, warnings multiplied. He tried to sit on the trail, claiming he needed 5 minutes. Joseph urged him to stay on his feet. At 18,860 feet, he stumbled, crossing his legs clumsily before collapsing. Priya described his eyes as unfocused, as though looking through her. Joseph placed an oxygen mask over his face and demanded immediate descent. The second guide hurried ahead with a stretcher alert, but conditions required they move Graham by dragging and half carrying. During the descent, he grew combative. He ripped off his gloves, clawed at his jacket, muttering incoherently. His lips darkened, skin mottled by cold and lack of oxygen. Joseph and the second guide laid him on a foam pad, shielding him with a bivy sack as spindrift gathered. They attempted oxygen and chest compressions when he no longer responded to pain. The radio crackled back with stretcher instructions. The guides alternated compressions and breaths in the snow. By 5:18, after repeated cycles, Joseph called off resuscitation. Graham's body was wrapped for evacuation, his summit dream ending beneath the crater edge. He was carried back to Barafu Camp, then down to Mweka Gate. A brief memorial was held in Moshi, his colleagues present but subdued, before his body was flown home. His London office organized a service, co-workers quietly acknowledging how pride had pushed him past warning signs. The Tanzanian medical examiner confirmed cerebral edema as the cause of death. Park authorities reviewed outfitter protocols, stressing that guide instructions must be final and that oxygen alone was insufficient. They urged operators to provide hyperbaric chambers for summit attempts, warning that ignoring early signs meant consequences far more permanent than a failed climb. It was September 3rd, 2015, on the western breach of Mount Kilimanjaro. Dawn light revealed fractured rock and streaks of thaw across the steep gully below Arrow Glacier as climbers moved cautiously. The day promised clear skies, but carried risks hidden in the mountain's unstable face. Elena Renfield was 28, an ICU nurse from Denver. She worked rotating shifts, balancing exhaustion with long hikes in the Rockies that became her outlet from hospital intensity. Colleagues admired her resilience and her deliberate approach to risk, often noting that her medical training made her more cautious than reckless. For Elena, summiting Kilimanjaro was not about conquest, but about seeking a quieter, more authentic route. She bypassed the crowded Morang and Machame paths, instead committing to the remote Lemosho variation with a western breach finish, a choice her friends said reflected her preference for solitude and challenge. The western breach was known for exposure and rockfall. Unlike the standard summit routes, it demanded helmets, close guide supervision, and early starts to reduce thaw hazard. The terrain comprised steep gullies filled with loose scree and blocks that shifted with temperature changes. That morning, the group left at first light. The night had been unusually warm, softening the frozen rock that normally stayed bonded until midday. A porter mentioned the thaw risk to the head guide, but the decision was to continue, reasoning that speed and helmets would mitigate danger. Elena tightened her chin strap, adjusted her trekking poles, and fell in step behind teammate Mark. The guide spaced the clients out, scanning the ridges above for movement. Crossing the gully was the most exposed section. The walls rose high on both sides, funneling debris if anything broke loose. The group was told to move quickly, but stay pressed against the left wall. Elena followed instructions, steady but tense, glancing up at the ridgeline. Mark, just ahead, later recalled the silence broken only by boots scraping scree. The warning came suddenly, a sharp shout of "rock." The first fragment smashed against the slope, spraying shards across helmets. Elena flinched, crouching low. A second rock, football-sized, struck the brim of her helmet and deflected into her face, cutting deep. Blood spread instantly across her cheek. She dropped to her knees, disoriented. Before she could recover, a larger rock ricocheted from the upper wall and struck her between the shoulders. Witnesses described her hands twitching briefly before she went limp. Guides rushed in, forming a shield with their bodies as smaller stones rattled down. When the slope quieted, they dragged her to a rib of rock shielded from the fall line. A check showed shallow breaths and unresponsive pupils. Her pulse weakened as they stabilized her neck and radioed a ranger post. A stretcher climb-up was impossible in that terrain, so they began a slow, precarious descent. Porters rotated positions, balancing it on shifting scree while others scouted ahead. Partway down, Elena lost pulses entirely. Guides began chest compressions in the thin air, cycling with rescue breaths, while porters stood guard for renewed rockfall. Despite repeated attempts, there was no response. By the time they reached Lava Tower, the effort had stopped. Emergency services were called, but they only declared her dead. Her remains were carried off the mountain by stretcher, then escorted down the Mueca route for eventual repatriation. In Colorado, her funeral was held in a closed casket service, attended by co-workers, family, and friends who remembered her dedication to both patients and the outdoors. Authorities issued a report afterward, reiterating that the western breach should only be attempted when freeze conditions held firm. They re-emphasized helmet mandates, strict timing advisories, and operator accountability in choosing routes. It was August 20th, 2018, on Kilimanjaro's upper slopes. The night began clear and still, but the mountain carried its own volatility. Between Barafu Camp and Stella Point, darkness and sudden weather changes would turn the routine summit corridor into a trap for those unprepared. Keiko Miyazaki, 52, worked as an office manager in Tokyo. Colleagues described her as meticulous, quiet, and disciplined. She trained for the climb through stairwell intervals and weekend hikes near Mount Takao, but she lacked true alpine exposure. This trip was a gift to herself and her adult son, a shared milestone after years of long work weeks. She purchased new gear for the climb, including a down jacket that had never been tested in wind-driven snow. Keiko approached the ascent with her usual thoroughness, but her background was in controlled environments, not in unpredictable extremes. The route from Barafu to the crater rim was straightforward by trekking standards, well-trodden switchbacks across scree slopes leading toward Stella Point at 18,800 feet, but the exposure at that altitude was absolute. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and wind could create whiteouts that erased both trail and bearings. The team left Barafu at midnight, 30 under a clear sky. With Keiko walking beside her son, by 2 a squall arrived. Wind scoured the slope, throwing spindrift into their lamps. Visibility collapsed to a few feet. The assistant guide, Amani, tightened the group into a cluster, counting heads at each halt. Keiko began to struggle. She complained that her right hand felt wooden, fumbling with her headlamp strap. Her son tried to adjust her gloves, but the storm pressed them forward. At 17,300 feet, Keiko drifted a few steps away from the kicked-in trail, her silhouette blurring in the snow flurries. Amani shouted as her figure vanished downslope. They scrambled to her position and found her lying on her side, snow stinging her face. She insisted she was fine, though her words slurred. Her son tried to replace her soaked liner gloves with spares. When Amani helped her to stand, her legs buckled and she collapsed again. Recognizing hypothermia, Amani pulled a bivy sack from his pack and wrapped her. They turned downhill immediately, but the gale cut into their pace. Wind chill made every pause dangerous. 10 minutes later, Keiko began repeating her own name, then trailed into silence. Her son begged to descend faster, but Amani called ahead on the radio, arranging help, and chose to shelter behind a rock rib for protection. He massaged her hands and tried to force warm drink into her mouth, but swallowing reflex faded. Keiko's shivering stopped. Her son later told rangers that her skin felt like ice even through the gloves. When two porters arrived an hour later with a stretcher, she was barely conscious, her carotid pulse weak and slowing. They strapped her in and began the descent. Within minutes, she lost responsiveness altogether. Repeated cycles of CPR continued as they moved lower, but her heart did not restart. By the time they reached Kosovo Campi, she was cold and pulseless. A Buddhist service was held in Moshi with the assistance of a local interpreter. Her body was repatriated quietly to Japan, where only a short obituary appeared in local news. Following the incident, authorities and park medics updated summit night briefings. Operators were urged to require proven cold weather gear, enforce glove and hand warmer redundancy, and regroup strictly at each switchback during storms. It was October 7th, 2017, at Barafu High Camp on Kilimanjaro's Machame route. The wind blew across the ridge in steady bursts, flattening tents and filling the air with grit. Climbers huddled in fabric shelters, waiting out the cold before their summit push. In one of those tents, a decision made for convenience would instead trigger disaster. Rahul Sarkar, 24, was a mechanical engineering student from Mumbai. He had always been drawn to tinkering with equipment, testing what others overlooked. Friends joked about his curiosity for fire and combustion. He had once modified a camp stove for a university demonstration. The climb was his first expedition outside India, planned with fellow alumni on a tight budget. His drive was less about mountaineering fame and more about proving resourcefulness. He was confident in improvising solutions, sometimes brushing aside rules he saw as overcautious. Kilimanjaro's high camps were not designed for comfort. Barafu sat at 15,300 feet on exposed scree, its tent platforms crowded with climbers. Open flames inside nylon tents were known hazards. Outfitters emailed warnings beforehand, emphasizing that stoves should only be used in communal cook tents with ventilation. A liquid fuel stove, when primed, could flare uncontrollably before stabilizing. Any spill risked igniting instantly in the thin, dry air. Most climbers accepted the protocol. Rahul saw it as an unnecessary restriction. That evening, after an acclimatization hike toward Kosovo camp, the group returned to Barafu to find space scarce. Winds battered the tents, making it uncomfortable to prepare water outside. Rahul decided to make tea inside his vestibule, insisting it would save time before the summit push. His tentmate, Arvind, protested weakly, but gave in as Rahul laughed about lab safety drills and set the stove on a foam pad. The vestibule was zipped tight against the wind, leaving no airflow. A porter passed by and noticed the faint smell of fuel, but assumed it would be extinguished quickly. Rahul primed the stove. A sudden flare shot upward, licking the vestibule fabric. He jerked back, striking the fuel bottle. Liquid splashed across the nylon floor and ignited. The vestibule became a torch within seconds. Arvind screamed and tried to kick the stove outside, but flames had already climbed the tent wall. From outside, the porter saw the glow intensify and rushed forward with a knife, slashing through the fly. Inside, Rahul's jacket caught fire at the shoulder and chest as the collapsing tent pinned him. Arvind crawled out coughing, skin blistering on his hands. Rangers and porters pulled Rahul free, dousing him with water bottles and shovels of snow. His jacket peeled away in burned strips, exposing deep, charred skin across his chest and neck. Black soot coated his mouth. He wheezed in short, shallow breaths, a sign of airway burns. Guides wrapped wet dressings and opened an oxygen cylinder, but his condition worsened. He was placed on a stretcher for descent toward Millennium Camp. Arvind, shaken and injured, stumbled behind as porters rotated carrying duty. Partway down, Rahul's breathing collapsed into gasps, then stopped altogether. A medic from another group attempted intubation with limited equipment, but could not maintain an airway through the swelling. CPR was performed as the stretcher was lowered in stages, but he did not regain a pulse. At Millennium Camp, the effort was called off. His remains were flown back to India, where his family arranged a closed cremation. Few outside his circle knew the details. Authorities issued immediate safety directives. Stoves were confiscated from client tents for the remainder of the season, with fines imposed for flame use in shelters. It was March 15, 2015, on the Barranco wall of Mount Kilimanjaro. Climbers in staggered lines began the slow ascent, ropes scraping rock. Among them, one man moved faster than most, carrying with him both confidence and an unseen threat that would not release him. Peter Damien, 43, from Cape Town, was known in his circle as a driven ultramarathoner. He He thrived on endurance events that punished the body, having completed multi-day desert races where temperatures reached extremes. Colleagues described him as meticulous in training, but dismissive of what he saw as unnecessary caution. For him, climbing Kilimanjaro was not about leisure, but efficiency. He chose the shorter 6-day Machame itinerary, pushing for speed. Sponsors from a regional athletic gear shop supplied his shoes and clothing, counting on him to return with photographs of their brand atop Africa's highest peak. Kilimanjaro's terrain is deceptive, non-technical yet punishing at altitude. The Barranco Wall, a 900-foot rise of basalt ledges and narrow traverses, demands strength and focus. Climbers advance in a slow, deliberate pace, the thin air forcing rest stops. Guides monitor oxygen saturation, heart rate, and hydration, especially after 12,000 feet. That morning, he had woken from a restless night at Barranco camp, coughing with a throat that felt raw. A pulse oximeter reading showed saturation in the low 80s, far below normal sea level values. His guide noted the numbers with concern. Peter brushed it aside, insisting he felt strong, and began the climb first. Others noticed his pace slowing midway. He paused more often, hands on his knees, lips showing a faint bluish hue. When asked to stop, he waved them on, unwilling to fall behind. Near the upper section, where the wall opens into switchbacks leading to Karanga Valley, Peter bent double, coughing hard. Pink froth appeared on his lips, a telltale sign his lungs were failing. His sister called out, and the lead guide, Musa, rushed forward. Peter tried to straighten, pushing for another step, then slumped onto a rock, gasping. Musa fitted bottled oxygen over his face and insisted on immediate descent. Peter attempted to rise but staggered, nearly falling off the narrow ledge until his sister grabbed his pack strap. His breathing grew rapid and wet, and he muttered that his chest felt flooded. They began a supported retreat down the wall, porters taking turns steadying him. Each step drained him further, the oxygen mask barely helping. Peter's skin turned gray, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool air. He collapsed on the trail, his eyes glassy, head rolling back as he struggled for breath. Porters hurried a stretcher into place, strapping him in while Musa directed the descent toward Karanga Valley. Clouds rolled in, cutting visibility and grounding the helicopter option. The group pressed on, stumbling over rocks as Peter's body weakened. By the time they reached the valley floor, his pulse was faint. Guides tried to clear fluid from his airway, wiping froth that continued to rise. Despite supplemental oxygen and chest compressions, his heart stopped before they could reach Karanga camp. His sister brought home his remains. Weeks later in Cape Town, his running club organized a service. Fellow athletes placed his race bibs on a table beside his photograph, and the club dedicated their annual ultramarathon to him. In Tanzania, park medics issued updated safety sheets warning of accelerated itineraries and fit but fast climbers who often underestimated acclimatization needs. Within months, most expeditions carried pulse oximeters at every stop as standard practice. It was February 26, 2018, on the crater rim of Mount Kilimanjaro. The morning climb had begun under clear skies, but by the time the team reached Stella Point, clouds had gathered, darkening the horizon. What should have been a brief push to the summit ridge was instead shaping into something unstable, with the kind of tension in the air that often precedes disaster. Alvaro Chavez, 34, from Spain, worked as a secondary school science teacher in Madrid. He loved to turn personal adventures into lessons for his students, often using his experiences outdoors to explain weather, geology, and physiology. He was cheerful, fond of jokes, and known for being both curious and stubborn. Friends described him as someone who underestimated danger, preferring to laugh it off rather than slow down. His trip to Kilimanjaro was funded in part by a small outdoor outfitter in Spain that supplied him with trekking gear, hoping he would return with photos to use in their catalog. Kilimanjaro's crater rim is a harsh place for mistakes. The ridge between Stella Point and Uhuru Peak runs narrow and exposed, with no shelter from sudden weather. The air is thin at over 18,000 feet, making judgment slower and reflexes weaker. Hail or rain turns the volcanic gravel slick. Metal equipment, common among trekkers, becomes a hazard when storms build. While guides train clients to recognize these dangers, summit fever often overrides caution, especially so close to the peak. That morning, the group's arrival at Stella Point coincided with cumulus clouds building rapidly. The lead guide, Rahema, urged caution, suggesting a quick photo before turning back if thunder grew nearer. Alvaro, however, was insistent about pressing on. When small hail began to fall, some clients hesitated. The group debated whether to continue along the final ridge. The discussion dragged until a low rumble rolled across the crater. Still, several clients leaned toward pushing on, unwilling to abandon the summit within sight. Rahema pressed them to decide quickly, reminding them of the risks. Alvaro stood with both poles upright, scanning the ridge as if waiting for consensus. The clouds thickened and the hail increased, pelting faces and hands. Despite warnings, momentum carried the group a short distance farther along the trail. Suddenly, a sharp crack of thunder followed almost instantly by a blinding flash struck the rim. The bolt hit directly where Alvaro stood. Witnesses saw his body arch backward before collapsing to the ground, smoke rising from his jacket. The sharp smell of ozone filled the air. His trekking poles clattered to the rocks, glowing briefly with residual heat. Rahema shouted for everyone to drop poles and crouch low, forcing the group to huddle against the lee side of the ridge as hail whipped around them. One client reached Alvaro first and saw a dark burn mark tracing from his neck down his chest, where a thin chain had rested. His breathing was absent, his pupils unresponsive. Rahema and another guide began compressions, alternating with attempts at rescue breathing. Each cycle yielded no change. The sound of thunder continued overhead, with more flashes flickering across the summit plateau. After repeated CPR efforts without a pulse, Rahema ordered the rest of the group to evacuate downslope, while 2 guides remained behind to secure the body once conditions stabilized. Later inspection confirmed entry and exit wounds consistent with a direct lightning strike. His clothing showed fused fabric and melted spots where the charge had traveled. Both poles bore scorch marks at their tips. The evidence left no doubt of the cause. Alvaro's remains were flown home, where a funeral was held with his family and colleagues from the school in attendance. Following the incident, authorities issued a new advisory circulated to all expedition operators. It emphasized dropping all metal objects when thunder is audible, abandoning summit attempts at the first sign of lightning, and avoiding exposed ridges entirely during electrical storms. It was March 14th, 2021, in Bangkok, Thailand. Along one of the city's main arterial roads, movement never stopped, engines idling, scooters weaving between lanes, and traffic lights flashing through smog. By dusk, a single live broadcast would turn the familiar chaos of the street into the setting for something tragic. Sudha Kongsri was 25, born and raised in the Thonburi district. She worked sporadically in retail, but had spent the past year building a following online for her short stunt clips. Her friends described her as impulsive but determined, someone who believed consistency didn't matter as much as spectacle. She filmed with a mid-range smartphone, using public spaces as her backdrop. Her posts drew modest attention until she started performing riskier challenges, often involving traffic, rooftops, or trains. The engagement made her restless. She measured success by real-time viewer counts. Sponsors never came officially, but local snack and fashion brands occasionally sent her small boxes of products, expecting tags in return. Her videos were raw and unedited, shot handheld in Bangkok's congested streets. The appeal for her audience was unpredictability. For Sudha, it was validation. On social media, she hinted that she wanted to hit 100,000 followers by the end of 2021. Privately, she told friends she wanted to be noticed by brands that matter. The more reckless her content became, the closer she felt to that goal. On the evening of March 14th, she started a live stream near an elevated pedestrian walkway above Ratchadaphisek Road, but stayed on ground level. The road was wide, 6 lanes in total, divided by a narrow raised concrete median. At around 6:30 p.m., the sky dimmed and rush hour thickened. She announced her next stunt, a cross-the-highway challenge, inspired by a similar viral clip trending from another country. Her viewers egged her on in the comments, some calling it fake, others daring her to prove it was real. Despite honking traffic and the warning of a friend off camera, she adjusted her phone, set it facing the lanes, and prepared to run. The lights ahead had just turned green, releasing a dense stream of cars, motorcycles, and buses. Sudha waited for what seemed like a gap, then sprinted across the first 3 lanes. She waved toward the camera, smiling mid-run. Witnesses later said she looked confident, even rehearsed. But as she reached the narrow median, her foot caught the chipped edge of the curb. The stumble wasn't dramatic. It was quick, almost invisible in the footage. yet it threw her off balance enough to send her forward into the oncoming side. The first impact came from a yellow taxi moving at around 45 miles per hour. Its front bumper hit her left side, folding her over the hood before she rolled off onto the asphalt. A white sedan behind the taxi swerved too late, clipping her legs as she landed. Eyewitnesses described a sudden silence after the collision, followed by several drivers pulling over. Traffic cameras confirmed that the incident unfolded in under 8 seconds. Rescuers arrived within minutes after being notified by motorists. Paramedics assessed her on site, but her pulse was absent. She had sustained massive blunt force trauma to her torso and pelvis. Police cordoned off 2 lanes, diverting traffic around the scene as commuters slowed to stare from their cars. The investigation concluded within 48 hours. Officials cited self-endangerment during digital content creation as the cause. Dashcam and CCTV footage supported the sequence exactly as seen online. There was no indication of foul play or driver negligence. For a few days, the spot drew small gatherings, candles, flowers, and people taking photos beside the median. Within a week, those traces disappeared, washed away by rain and traffic. It was July 7th, 2019, deep in the Everglades, Florida. A small boat moved along a flooded trail lined with sawgrass and cypress roots, carrying 2 young men with a camera bag and a goal. They had launched from a small access near the C-111 canal, about 20 miles southwest of Homestead. By mid-afternoon, this filming trip would turn into a failed rescue call, replayed by investigators frame by frame. Tyler Jenkins was 22, a part-time landscaper from Homestead. He ran a small TikTok account where he filmed himself catching or showing wild reptiles. His videos drew modest traffic, sometimes a few thousand views, but enough to convince him it could grow. He admired wildlife handlers and online survival personalities, copying their presentation style but without their training or safety gear. His family described him as restless and easily thrilled, someone who wanted to prove he wasn't afraid of Florida's wildlife. He'd handled non-venomous snakes dozens of times, posting clips with titles about bravery and respecting nature. None of those stunts had gone wrong before. The Everglades that season were at peak flood. The water level was high, which meant snakes moved closer to the levees and narrow dry banks. Cottonmouths, water moccasins, were common. They blended with fallen branches, resting motionless until disturbed. Tyler and his cameraman, a friend named Eric, used a small John boat to reach deeper into the swamp, armed only with a camera, a long-handled fishing net, and rubber boots. He'd mentioned in a message earlier that morning that he wanted something riskier to post before summer ended, complaining his latest uploads were too tame. That afternoon, around 3:40 p.m., the pair stopped along a shallow edge near mangroves, where they noticed a dark snake coiled near a root cluster. Tyler pointed it out, telling Eric to start filming. The snake's triangular head and thick body were obvious signs of venom, but Tyler dismissed it as an easy one. Eric hesitated, suggesting they skip it and move on, but Tyler crouched closer with the camera still rolling. He reached down with his right hand, trying to grab the snake just behind its head. The strike came instantly. The cottonmouth lunged upward, its mouth flashing white, and its fangs sank into his wrist. Eric's footage later confirmed a single, deep puncture with immediate bleeding. Tyler jerked back, shouting. The snake fell into the water and disappeared. He pressed his hand against his shirt, visibly panicking. Within minutes, swelling began to rise from his wrist to his forearm. Eric mentioned his breathing quickening, his voice fading as he tried to stay upright. Eric used his phone to call emergency services, relaying their GPS coordinates. Dispatchers advised him to keep Tyler calm and still, but the symptoms advanced fast: nausea, vomiting, and confusion. At 4:05 p.m., roughly 25 minutes after the bite, Tyler's blood pressure began to collapse. His face turned pale, his speech slurred. Eric attempted to row the boat back toward the road access, but dense vegetation slowed progress. Rescue crews reached them at 4:38 p.m., using an airboat guided by a ranger familiar with the area. Tyler was unresponsive, with shallow breathing and extensive swelling up to his shoulder. Paramedics noted severe hypotension and respiratory distress, consistent with systemic envenomation. They initiated advanced life support, administering oxygen and cardiac compressions en route to the landing site. But he showed no recovery. At 5:12 p.m., he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the Homestead Hospital. The State Wildlife Commission reviewed the video and confirmed the snake was a Florida cottonmouth. an adult roughly 2.5 feet long. Toxicology results were consistent with envenomation causing rapid circulatory collapse. In the weeks that followed, Eric withdrew from social media entirely. Investigators described him as cooperative, but visibly shaken, replaying the video multiple times during questioning. He later told reporters he couldn't return to the swamp again. Friends said he stopped filming wildlife altogether. It was February 12, 2020, on the frozen expanse of Lake Winnebago, Wisconsin. A small group of friends had gathered near the south shore, where snowmobile tracks etched uneven lines into the ice. What started as a lighthearted recording for TikTok would soon turn into a silent disaster unfolding beneath the frozen lake. Hannah Larson was 19, a first-year student at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. She ran a modest TikTok account where she filmed winter activities, lake plunges, ice skating, and harmless snow stunts. Her followers were small in number, but enthusiastic. Friends described her as confident and attention-driven. She had grown up near the lake and often claimed she knew the ice, believing local familiarity kept her safe. Lake Winnebago's ice that winter was inconsistent. Temperatures had fluctuated for days, creating areas of soft slush and uneven thickness. Locals knew that sections along the southern shore where currents flowed rarely froze solid. Despite repeated warnings from local authorities about weak ice, Hannah and a classmate decided to film a skating clip for her next post. She brought a pair of figure skates, her phone mounted to a tripod, and a lightweight rope she claimed was just in case. Her friend carried a small camera to capture side angles for editing. Neither wore flotation aids or ice picks, standard safety gear for lake activity. By early afternoon, they had chosen a section of ice a few hundred feet from shore. The cold wind moved across the lake, scattering powdery snow and revealing dark patches beneath. Nearby, anglers had avoided the area entirely. Hannah dismissed the visible cracks, stepping onto the surface and testing it with one foot before gliding forward. She laughed to the camera, narrating how the ice sang, referring to the echoing pops beneath her skates. Her friend filmed from a safe distance, repeatedly warning that the surface looked unstable. Hannah continued further, spinning once, then crouching for a shot closer to the tripod. At 2:14 p.m., the camera captured the first sharp crack. The sound echoed across the frozen surface. The ice under her right skate fractured in a jagged circle, then dropped. She screamed as she plunged waist-deep before the panel fully gave way. The water was near freezing, an estimated 33 degrees Fahrenheit. Her immediate reaction showed the cold shock response. A violent gasp, arms thrashing for balance, breath rapidly lost. The hole widened as she struggled, breaking apart more of the thin ice edge. Her friend rushed forward, throwing the rope, but it landed just short. When he tried to crawl closer, the ice under him creaked and collapsed in pieces, forcing him to retreat. Hannah managed to grab the edge once, but couldn't lift herself. The wet sleeves froze stiff against her skin. Within 90 seconds, she lost strength, her movements slowing. Emergency calls were made by her friend at 2:17 p.m. Local responders arrived within 15 minutes with a hovercraft unit and ice rescue divers. They located the opening and marked it with poles before descending. At 2:44 p.m., divers recovered Hannah's body approximately 10 feet from the entry hole, under a thin ice layer that had begun to refreeze. She showed no vital signs upon extraction and was declared deceased on scene. The Winnebago County Coroner's report listed cold water immersion leading to drowning as the cause of death. Analysis of the footage aligned with known cold water physiology, loss of breath control, rapid incapacitation, and submersion within 3 minutes. In the following days, the lake grew strangely quiet. Locals stopped skating near the south shore. The hole refroze, but the surrounding snow remained marked by poles and footprints for weeks. No formal statements followed. Just a caution passed quietly through the campus and among fishermen who'd seen the rescue lights that afternoon. It was September 18, 2020, in Pune, India. Inside a second-floor apartment, a 21-year-old man prepared his latest science experiment video, something meant to look impressive and improvised. The setup was clumsy but deliberate. A plastic table, scattered bottles, a phone balanced on a stand, unfitting for what would happen next. Ravi Sharma had built a modest online following through short DIY and science hack TikTok videos. A dropout from a local engineering diploma course, he spent his days experimenting with homemade devices, baking soda rockets, small smoke bombs, and chemical reactions copied from online tutorials. His small audience rewarded spectacle. Every video that involved fire or loud noise got more views. Ravi had no real training in chemistry, but learned terminology from forums and clips that simplified dangerous procedures. He lived with his parents and younger sister in a 2-bedroom flat in a dense residential neighborhood of Dapodi. His workshop was the balcony-turned-storage room where he filmed most of his content. Over time, he collected materials sold in hardware and hobby stores, oxidizers, propellants, and adhesives. To make his videos more dramatic, he often modified designs to exaggerate results. The day before the incident, he told his sister he wanted to make a mini rocket engine using compressed powder fuel inspired by an overseas YouTuber. Unlike commercial kits, his setup lacked venting or structural reinforcement. That Friday afternoon, the plan was to test the homemade rocket indoors to see how strong the thrust would be. His mother was cooking lunch while Ravi arranged a small aluminum canister on his desk. The propellant mixture, potassium nitrate granules blended with sugar and binder, was tightly packed into the canister and sealed with epoxy. He aimed to ignite it with a wire connected to an adapter, recording the moment with his phone. The device was effectively a sealed pressure vessel, something that, if ignited, could not vent gas safely. Several neighbors later reported hearing him talking excitedly to his camera. The live stream began just before 2:20 p.m. and showed him explaining the chemical rocket demo. As he touched the wire leads to power, a brief hiss preceded a flash. The reaction was almost instantaneous, a violent deflagration instead of propulsion. The canister ruptured, producing a concussive blast that blew out the room's windows and filled the frame with white light. The camera fell sideways but continued recording audio, crackling flames, shouting, and falling debris. The explosion ignited nearby paper and plastic, triggering a flash fire that spread to the curtains and the wooden shelf. Neighbors in adjacent flats heard the blast and rushed into the corridor, where smoke poured from the window openings. Ravi was later found collapsed near the door, his upper body severely burned, with cuts from metal fragments. Paramedics called by neighbors arrived within 15 minutes, but found no pulse. Fire crews extinguished the blaze within 30 minutes, preventing spread to neighboring units. Forensic investigators determined that the deflagration was caused by overpressure inside the sealed canister, a predictable result of confinement without venting. The Pune Fire Department reported that the blast shattered glass in 2 adjacent apartments, slightly injuring one resident. Investigators ruled the case accidental, citing reckless handling of volatile materials. Local housing authorities ordered minor structural repairs, and neighbors recalled the smell of burnt plastic lingering for weeks. Ravi's family cremated him 2 days later in a small ceremony. It was November 6, 2021, in Shanghai, China. It was evening in Nanjing Road, with crowds gathered for the annual Autumn Night Market Festival. Alongside tens of thousands of others, one young woman pushed toward the center where performers stood elevated above the crowd. Li Mei was 24, a retail worker at a clothing store in the Jing'an district. She supplemented her income through live streaming and TikTok clips, street food reviews, nightlife walks, and festival coverage. Her goal was to build an audience large enough to attract brand sponsorships. Colleagues said she was soft-spoken off camera but driven online, often going out alone after work to record. She used a stabilizer-mounted phone and a small LED light, tools she considered essential to stand out in a saturated local content scene. By early November, Shanghai's downtown events had drawn record numbers following months of relaxed restrictions. The festival that night featured food stalls, music, and pop-up exhibitions. With crowd density peaking near the central intersection, police barriers were present, but pedestrian flow overwhelmed available space. Event organizers had encouraged live streamers to share the energy, indirectly pushing creators like Lee to get closer to the action. Her footage often depended on proximity, crowd reactions, motion, sound. That pursuit of closeness would put her directly in the path of the surge. Around 8:40 p.m., Lee began streaming from just off a vendor's canopy, narrating as she moved forward through the thick crowd. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on framing her shot rather than her footing. The crowd was tightly packed, People shoulder to shoulder, movement limited to inches. Some tried to retreat, but couldn't. When a performer threw promotional items into the air, hundreds surged forward simultaneously. Pressure waves rippled through the mass of bodies. Those who survived recalled a sudden collapse of order. The front rows pushed against the barriers, which flexed but didn't break. Lee's stream captured shaking footage of the rush, screams blending with muffled audio before the camera angle dropped. In the confusion, she stumbled as the surge knocked her sideways. People behind her continued moving, unaware she had fallen. Within seconds, she was pinned beneath multiple individuals, her body compressed by hundreds of pounds of weight from above. Eyewitnesses described an immediate inability to breathe among those in the densest section. Several fainted upright. The few who tried to help were themselves immobilized by the pressure. Security personnel forced open a small channel minutes later, pulling limp bodies from the front. When rescuers reached Lee, she showed no movement. On-scene medical responders performed chest compressions, but there were no spontaneous breaths. They transported her to a nearby hospital within 10 minutes, where she was declared dead on arrival. The cause was compressive asphyxia, prolonged chest wall restriction, preventing effective breathing. Other victims from adjacent sections suffered fractures, bruising, and fainting episodes, but survived. City officials issued a statement within 2 days, describing the incident as a sudden crowd compression during the night market. No individuals or organizations were formally blamed, and the investigation concluded without charges. The following weekend, the festival reopened under stricter crowd limits. Lee's family collected her remains in private, declining all interview requests. It was March 15, 2020, in Los Angeles, California. The city was under the subdued unease of the early pandemic, but online audiences were restless. Inside a cluttered one-bedroom apartment in Glendale, a small ring light cast a harsh glow on an exhausted face. By the end of that night, the broadcast that began as another endurance challenge would end as a medical emergency caught live. Ethan Morales was 20 years old, a community college student studying digital media. He had gained modest online traction for his self-filmed endurance stunts. Fasting, sleeplessness, and high caffeine intake, each presented as a test of willpower. His content relied on pushing limits, with sponsorships from small supplement resellers and an energy drink distributor that occasionally sent him free cases to promote. Off-camera, he worked part-time at a tech store and lived with 2 roommates who mostly ignored his filming. He was known for competitiveness and a visible need to prove resilience to his audience, often framing discomfort as discipline. The Stay Awake challenge was familiar territory. Ethan's setup was basic: a laptop, 2 cameras, and constant access to energy drinks. The commercial products he used contained caffeine, taurine, and guarana extracts. In large doses, they could elevate heart rate and blood pressure, especially when paired with lack of sleep. He had read the labels but dismissed warnings, referencing past attempts where he claimed to stay awake for 60 hours without issue. His growing followers encouraged him, sending donations and urging him to push for 72 hours this time. On March 13th, he began streaming on TikTok from his desk, documenting every hour awake. For the first day, he seemed stable, chatting, gaming, pacing his apartment. By the second night, his speech slowed and his posture sagged. His chat filled with both concern and encouragement. The room behind him dimmed as the daylight hours blurred together. Empty cans piled beside his chair, and his skin took on a pale, clammy tone. By the third morning, he had consumed the equivalent of over 2,500 milligrams of caffeine, roughly 15 cans, and several concentrated shots. That afternoon, around the 68th hour, his stream showed brief tremors in his hands as he held another can. Viewers noticed he had trouble keeping his head upright. He slurred words, describing dizziness and warmth in his chest. About 20 minutes later, he suddenly stiffened and fell sideways out of frame. The camera, still recording, caught faint twitching movements and the chair rolling back. Comments flooded the chat, some confused, others alarmed. After 2 minutes with no movement, several viewers traced his location through prior streams and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, forced entry with the help of the building manager, and found Ethan unresponsive beside the desk. The apartment smelled strongly of artificial fruit and caffeine powder. Resuscitation attempts began immediately and continued en route to Glendale Memorial Hospital. His initial rhythm showed ventricular fibrillation that progressed to cardiac arrest. Despite multiple defibrillations and doses of epinephrine and amiodarone, he never regained a pulse. A later autopsy confirmed a pre-existing, undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that had made him especially vulnerable to stimulant overload. The energy drink distributor quietly ended all informal promotions with online creators the following week. No public statement was released, and their social media accounts avoided any mention of Ethan or endurance content for the rest of the year. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.